The notice had been nailed to the trading post wall for 23 days. 23 days of Wyoming wind battering the paper until the ink started to fade and the corners curled like dying leaves. 23 days of men reading it, grunting, then walking away because no amount of desperation made a man want to work for Gideon Vale. Cook wanted. Room and meals provided. Must endure hard work and silence. That last part wasn't a warning. It was a promise. Gideon stood in the trading post on a Thursday afternoon, pretending to examine saddle soap while actually watching to see if anyone would take the notice down. Nobody did. They never even stopped walking. Just glanced at it the way you glance at a grave marker. Acknowledgement without engagement. Still no takers, Vale? Gideon didn't turn around. He knew the voice. Chester Morrow, the trading post owner, a man who treated gossip like currency and spent it freely. Don't need takers, Gideon said. Need a cook. What you need is a miracle. Chester leaned against the counter, his substantial belly testing the buttons on his vest. Or maybe just to stop being such a miserable bastard that nobody wants to work for you. Gideon set down the saddle soap harder than necessary. You got something useful to say, Chester? Or are you just warming up your jaw? I'm saying you can't keep running that ranch alone. You look like hell, Vale. When's the last time you ate something that didn't come from a can? I'm managing. You're dying slow. Chester picked at his teeth with a wooden sliver. Everybody knows it. Even Holloway knows it. He's just waiting for you to collapse so he can snap up that valley without the hassle of forcing you out. At the mention of Vern Holloway, something cold moved through Gideon's chest. Not fear exactly. More like the feeling you get when you spot a rattlesnake coiled in the shade, awareness that danger exists whether you acknowledge it or not. Holloway can wait until he rots, Gideon said. He's a patient man when it comes to other people's suffering. Chester straightened up, his tone shifting to something almost sympathetic. Look, I'm not trying to needle you. I'm saying that notice has been up almost a month. Maybe you need to change the terms, offer more money, or at least take out that bit about silence. Makes you sound like you're hiring for a funeral home, not a ranch. Gideon finally looked at him. The silence stays. Chester raised both hands in surrender. Your funeral, friend. It wasn't the first time someone had said that to Gideon, and it probably wouldn't be the last. He left the trading post without buying anything, mounted his horse, a gray gelding named Ash who was almost as antisocial as his owner, and started the long ride back to Black Hollow Valley. The valley sat 17 miles northwest of town, tucked between two ridgelines that turned purple at sunset. It had good water, decent grazing, and enough timber to keep a man supplied through winter. Gideon's father had claimed it in 1849, back when claiming land meant you were willing to bleed for it, and probably would. The elder Vale had bled plenty, so had his wife, and eventually, so had Gideon. The ranch house came into view as the sun started its descent. It was a solid structure, log walls chinked with mud and moss, a stone chimney that drew smoke clean, a porch that wrapped around the front. His father had built it to last, and it had. Everything else had proven less durable. The barn needed repairs. The corral fence sagged in 3 places. The bunkhouse where ranch hands once slept stood empty, its door hanging crooked on leather hinges that should have been replaced 2 years ago. Gideon saw all of it with the clarity of someone who'd stopped caring whether things got fixed. He unsaddled Ash, rubbed him down with hands that trembled from exhaustion, then walked to the house. Inside, the air felt thick and stale. Dishes sat unwashed in the basin. The stove was cold. A pot from 3 days ago still sat on the counter, its contents now fuzzy with mold. Gideon didn't look at it. He went to the cupboard, found a can of beans, opened it with his knife, and ate standing up. The beans were cold and tasted like tin. He barely noticed. Eating had become something his body demanded, not something he enjoyed, like breathing, like waking up. After the beans, he poured 3 fingers of whiskey into a cup that hadn't been washed since last week. The whiskey burned going down. The good kind of burn, the kind that reminded you that you were still capable of feeling something. He sat at the table and stared at nothing in particular. This was his routine now. Work until dark. Eat something barely edible. Drink enough to make sleep possible, but not enough to make tomorrow impossible. Repeat until dead. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice that sounded disturbingly like his father's asked, "This is what you wanted?" Gideon took another drink. He hadn't wanted this. Nobody wants to become the kind of man who drives people away through sheer force of bitterness. But wanting and becoming are different things, and somewhere along the way, Gideon had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. It had started 15 years ago. No, that wasn't quite right. It had started 20 years ago when he met Sarah Brennan at a barn dance in Cheyenne. She'd been 19, dark-haired, and possessed of the kind of smile that made you believe in things you'd previously considered foolish. Like happiness. Like forever. They'd married 6 months later. The first 5 years had been good, better than good. They'd worked the ranch together, talked about children, made plans that felt solid as bedrock. Sarah had a way of turning even the hardest days into something bearable. She sang while she cooked. She laughed at his bad jokes. She made the house feel like more than just walls and a roof. Then came the winter of 1861. The war back east was pulling men away, and money was getting tight. Gideon had taken a job driving cattle to the railroad, a 6-week trip that would pay enough to see them through until spring. Sarah had told him to go, had kissed him goodbye, had promised to be there when he got back. He'd returned to an empty house. No note, no explanation, just her clothes gone from the wardrobe and her hairbrush missing from the dresser. At first he'd thought something terrible had happened, kidnapping, accident, violence, but the neighbors told a different story. They'd seen her leave, seen her pack a trunk, seen her ride away in a wagon with a man from Laramie, a man she'd apparently known before Gideon. The betrayal had gutted him. Not the leaving, though that was bad enough, but the calculated nature of it. She'd waited until he was gone, waited until he was too far away to stop her or ask why. Just vanished like smoke, leaving him to piece together what had happened from the pitying looks of people who'd known before he did. Gideon had tried to find her, rode to Laramie, asked questions, followed dead ends until his money ran out and his pride ran dry. Eventually, he'd come back to the ranch and realized the truth. Sarah was gone because she wanted to be gone. Chasing her was just another way of refusing to accept what she'd already decided. So he'd stopped chasing, started building walls instead. Over the years, those walls had become a fortress. He'd hired ranch hands, but never let them get close. Went to town only when necessary, kept conversations short and business-focused. The few women who'd shown interest had quickly learned that Gideon Vale wasn't a man who warmed up with time. He was a man who'd frozen solid, and no amount of patience was going to thaw him. The whiskey bottle was nearly empty now. Gideon looked at it with the detached interest of someone observing his own decline from a distance. He should eat more, should wash the dishes, should fix the fence before winter came and made everything harder. Should. He drained the cup and went to bed instead. The wagon appeared 3 days later. Gideon was mucking out the barn, a job he'd been putting off for 2 weeks, when he heard wheels crunching over the rocky path that led to his gate. He straightened up, pitchfork in hand, squinting against the afternoon sun. A wagon. Weather-beaten, pulled by 2 horses that looked as tired as he felt. And on the seat, a woman. His first thought was that she'd gotten lost. The second thought was irritation that he'd have to give directions and waste time he didn't have. He stabbed the pitchfork into a hay bale and walked out to meet her, prepared to be unhelpful in the most efficient way possible. The wagon stopped 10 feet from where he stood. Up close, he could see that the woman was maybe 30, with dark hair pulled back in a braid and a face that had seen its share of hard miles. She wore a plain dress that had been mended in several places, and her hands on the reins showed calluses that meant she was used to work. But it was the children that made him stop short. 3 of them, sitting in the back of the wagon among crates and bundles of belongings. 2 boys and a girl, all watching him with expressions that ranged from wary to outright suspicious. "You Gideon Vale?" the woman asked. Her voice was steady. Not friendly, but not hostile either. Just matter-of-fact, like she was confirming a delivery address. "Who's asking?" "Mara Quinn." She set the brake and climbed down from the wagon with practiced ease. "I'm here about the cook position." For a moment, Gideon just stared at her. Then he found his voice. "I didn't post for a woman." "You posted for a cook." She brushed dust from her skirt. "Didn't specify male or female in the notice. Didn't specify female with 3 children either. That's because you can't cook worth a damn and you're not in a position to be particular." She said it without heat, just stated it like a fact. "I saw the notice. Chester Morrow said it's been up nearly a month with no takers. So either you're the worst employer in Wyoming, or people are smart enough to know that working for a man who demands silence probably means working for a man who's halfway to crazy. Gideon's jaw tightened. Chester talks too much. Chester talks exactly enough. Mara gestured to the children. This is Elias, Ruby, and Cal. They're well-behaved, hard-working, and they won't bother you if you don't bother them. I can cook anything you've got ingredients for. I keep a clean house, and I don't need conversation to get work done. What I do need is a roof over our heads and regular meals. That what you're offering? I'm offering a job for one person. Then you're going to die of your own cooking. She crossed her arms. We're a package deal, Mr. Vale. You hire me, you get all of us. We stay together, or we don't stay at all. The oldest boy, Elias, was watching him with dark, measuring eyes. The girl, Ruby, had her arms wrapped around the youngest, Cal, who was clutching some kind of carved wooden animal. They all looked tired, more than tired. They looked like people who'd been moving for a long time without finding anywhere to stop. Gideon recognized the expression. He'd seen it in the mirror enough times. Where's your husband? He asked. Mara's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. Dead. Quarry collapsed 2 years ago. Anything else you need to know, or are we going to keep standing here until the sun sets? I don't need children running around my ranch, and I don't need a man telling me what I need. She took a step forward, and despite being half a foot shorter than him, somehow made it feel like she was looking down. You want to keep living like this? Eating burnt food, working yourself into an early grave, letting this place fall apart because you're too stubborn to accept help? Fine. Send us away. But don't pretend it's because of my children. Pretend it's because you're scared. Scared of what? Of not being alone. The words hit him like a fist to the chest. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The wind kicked up dust devils in the yard. One of the horses stamped and blew through its nose. From the wagon, the little girl, Ruby, spoke up. Can you bake bread? Gideon blinked. What? Mama's asking if you want her cooking. Ruby leaned forward, her face serious. But I'm asking if you can bake bread, because if you can, then you don't need Mama. But if you can't, then you're lying to yourself about what you need. Gideon looked at the girl. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, but her eyes were older than that. Eyes that had seen too much and learned to see through even more. I can't bake bread, he admitted. Then you need Mama. Ruby sat back, apparently satisfied with her logic. Mara was watching him now, waiting, not pleading, not desperate, just waiting for him to make a decision that they both knew he'd already made the moment he didn't immediately send them away. Bunkhouse needs cleaning, Gideon said finally. Hasn't been used in 5 years, roof might leak. We've lived in worse. I don't want noise. We're not loud. I don't want questions. We're not curious. Mara paused. About you, anyway. He should say no. Should tell them to turn around and find some other desperate fool who needed help. This was a mistake. You don't let people in. You don't give them a chance to leave. You don't hand them the tools to hurt you and hope they choose not to use them. But then he looked at the children again. At Elias, trying to appear tough while fear leaked through the cracks. At Ruby, playing negotiator because someone had to. At Cal, who still hadn't said a single word. And he thought about that empty house. About cold beans eaten standing up, about whiskey and dirty cups and sleeping alone in a bed that used to hold 2, about dying slow while pretending it was living. 1 month, he said. Trial basis. If it doesn't work out, you leave without argument. If it doesn't work out, Mara agreed, but it will. She said it with the kind of certainty that made him wonder what she knew that he didn't. They moved into the bunkhouse that afternoon. Gideon helped unload the wagon, mostly because standing around watching felt worse than helping, and was surprised by how little they'd brought. 3 crates of belongings, some blankets, a trunk that Elias and Mara carried between them. Everything they owned fit in the back of a single wagon. He'd expected more, expected complications, expected reasons why this was going to be difficult. Instead, Mara just pointed to where things should go, directed the children with quiet efficiency, and had the bunkhouse organized within an hour. She swept out 5 years of dust and cobwebs, hung blankets over the windows to make dividers, Set up 3 sleeping areas that somehow made the single room feel like separate spaces. Gideon watched from the doorway, not helping with this part because it felt too intimate, like watching someone arrange their life right in front of you. "It'll do," Mara said, more to herself than to him. "Roof leaks," Gideon repeated, "over by the far corner. Then we'll put a bucket there." She looked at him directly. "We've managed with less, Mr. Vale. This is fine." "It's Gideon." She paused, something unreadable crossing her face. "All right, Gideon." Hearing his name in her voice felt strange. Most people called him Vale, if they called him anything. First names required familiarity, and Gideon had spent 15 years making sure nobody got familiar. "I'll show you the kitchen," he said. "It's not organized." That turned out to be an understatement. When Mara walked into the ranch house kitchen, she stopped short. Just stood there, taking in the unwashed dishes, the moldy pot, the stove covered in grease, the floor that probably hadn't been swept since spring. She didn't say anything, just rolled up her sleeves. "Elias," she called over her shoulder. "Fetch water. Ruby, find me rags. Cal, you stay outside and play where I can see you." The children scattered to their tasks without argument. Gideon stood awkwardly in his own kitchen, feeling like an intruder, unsure whether to stay or leave. "You got lye soap?" Mara asked, already pulling dishes from the basin. "Under the sink." She found it, along with a brush that had seen better days. Then she looked at him expectantly. "You planning to stand there all afternoon, or do you have work to do?" "I have work." "Then go do it." Her tone wasn't dismissive, just practical. "I'll call you when dinner's ready." Gideon left feeling oddly displaced in his own home. Uncle. He retreated to the barn, intending to finish mucking out the stalls, but found himself instead sitting on a hay bale, just listening. From the house came the sounds of activity, water being pumped, dishes clattering, Mara's voice giving directions, Ruby's higher voice asking questions he couldn't quite hear. Normal sounds. The kind that used to fill this place before silence became the only resident. He didn't know how to feel about it. Part of him wanted to march back there and remind them about the silence requirement. Part of him wanted to hide in the barn until they all went to bed. And part of him, a part he didn't want to acknowledge, wanted to sit here and just listen to what a living house sounded like. He chose the work instead. Finished the stalls. Checked the corral fence. Counted cattle. Kept himself busy until the sun started to set and the temperature dropped enough that going inside seemed reasonable rather than avoidant. When he entered the kitchen, he stopped. The room had been transformed. Dishes washed and stacked, counters scrubbed, floor swept. The stove actually looked clean, its surface gleaming in the lamplight. The moldy pot was gone, probably thrown out, and on the table sat a meal that made his throat tight. Roast chicken, potatoes, beans that hadn't come from a can, and bread. Fresh bread, still warm, the smell filling every corner of the kitchen. Mara was setting out plates. She glanced up when he entered. "Sit down," she said, "before it gets cold." He sat. The children filed in moments later, clean-faced and quiet. They took seats without being told where, some kind of established routine that they'd obviously done 1,000 times before. Cal still had his wooden wolf, which he set carefully beside his plate. Nobody spoke. Mara served the food, and they ate in the silence Gideon had demanded. But it wasn't the same silence he'd lived in for years. This silence had people in it. The chicken was better than anything he'd tasted in recent memory. The potatoes had herbs he didn't know he still owned. And the bread. The bread was exactly what Mara had promised. The kind that made hard days forget themselves. He ate slowly, aware of the children watching him with sidelong glances. Aware of Mara eating with the same practiced efficiency she brought to everything else. Aware that his kitchen table, which had sat empty for so long, now held 5 people instead of 1. "Thank you for the meal," he said finally. It came out awkward, rusty from disuse. Mara nodded. "You're welcome." They finished eating. Mara started clearing plates. Gideon stood to help, then hesitated, unsure if that was allowed or expected or... "Elias helps with dishes," Mara said, reading his uncertainty. "Ruby and Cal get ready for bed. You can sit on the porch if you want. We'll be quiet." He should have gone to the porch. Instead, he found himself saying, "I'll heat water for washing." Something changed in Mara's expression. Not quite a smile, but close enough. That'd be helpful, she said. So Gideon heated water while Elias brought dishes to the basin, and Mara washed them with the kind of rhythm that spoke of years doing this exact task. Nobody talked, but the silence felt different now, comfortable. Like the quiet between people who didn't need words to coordinate. When the dishes were done, Mara sent the children back to the bunkhouse. They went without complaint, even Cal, who clutched his wooden wolf like a talisman against the dark. Then it was just Gideon and Mara in the kitchen. "They're good kids," Gideon said. "They are." Mara hung the towel to dry. "They've had to be." "The wolf. What's the story there?" Mara's hand stilled for a moment. "His father carved it for him. Week before the accident, Cal hasn't let it out of his sight since." Gideon nodded slowly. He understood talismans against loss. His entire ranch had become one. "I'll leave you to your evening," Mara said. "Breakfast at sunrise?" "That's fine." She moved toward the door, then paused. "This arrangement. It's going to work, Gideon. I know you don't believe it yet, but it will." "How can you be sure?" She looked back at him, and in the lamplight her face held the kind of certainty that came from surviving things that should have broken you. "Because we're both too stubborn to fail," she said. Then she was gone, the door closing softly behind her. Gideon stood alone in his clean kitchen, surrounded by the smell of bread and the lingering warmth of a meal shared. Outside he could see lamplight in the bunkhouse windows. Could hear, faintly, the sound of a mother getting children ready for sleep. He poured himself a drink. But tonight, he only poured one finger instead of three. And when he sat at the table, he didn't feel quite so much like a ghost. Maybe Mara was right. Maybe this would work. Or maybe it would all fall apart like everything else he'd ever tried to hold on to. Either way, for the first time in 15 years, Gideon Vale went to bed in a house that felt like something more than just walls and a roof. It felt almost like a home. The first week passed in a kind of cautious choreography. Gideon woke before dawn, dressed in the dark, and emerged to find breakfast already on the table. Eggs, biscuits, coffee that didn't taste like boiled dirt. Mara served it without comment, and he ate without conversation. The children appeared, ate quickly, and disappeared back to the bunkhouse or the yard. Then Gideon would head out to work, and the house would fill with sounds he tried not to notice. Water being pumped, floors being swept, Mara humming something wordless while she worked. It should have felt invasive. Instead, it just felt strange. Like wearing new boots that hadn't broken in yet. Not painful, but not comfortable either. Just different. He'd catch himself listening for those sounds during the day. Would find himself walking past the house when he didn't need to, just to see if the windows were open, or if Ruby was sitting on the porch steps playing with Cal's wooden wolf. Once, he looked up from fixing fence wire and saw Elias watching him from the barn door, and when their eyes met, the boy disappeared so fast it was like he'd never been there. They were sharing space, but not sharing anything else, which was exactly what Gideon had wanted. So why did it feel wrong? On the 8th day, the careful distance started to crack. Gideon was replacing boards on the corral fence, a job he'd been putting off since spring because it required more hands than he had, when he heard boots crunching across the yard. He looked up to find Elias standing 10 feet away, hands shoved in his pockets, trying to look casual and failing. "Need something?" Gideon asked. Elias shrugged. "Mama said I should ask if you need help." "Did she?" "Yeah." The boy kicked at a rock. "Said I'm eating your food, so I should earn my keep." Gideon set down his hammer. The boy was maybe 11, rail-thin, with dark hair that fell into his eyes and a jawline that suggested stubbornness ran in the family. He was trying to appear indifferent, but his hands kept clenching and unclenching in his pockets. "You know anything about fence work?" Gideon asked. "Some. Worked on a ranch near Laramie for a while, before—" He trailed off. "Before your father died." Elias's expression went flat. "Yeah, before that." Gideon recognized the look, the way grief turned into armor, and armor made you hard. He'd worn that same face for 15 years. "All right," he said, "hand me that board over there." Elias moved quickly, relieved to have something to do. He passed the board, then stood waiting for more instructions, and Gideon found himself explaining the work more than he'd intended. How to check for rot, where to place the nails so the wood wouldn't split, why you had to replace 3 boards at once instead of just the broken one, because weight distribution mattered. The boy listened, didn't interrupt. Didn't ask stupid questions. Just paid attention like information was currency he couldn't afford to waste. They worked in silence for a while, the only sounds the hammer striking nails and the occasional grunt of effort. It wasn't uncomfortable silence, just focused. The kind of quiet that happens when two people are concentrating on the same task. "Why'd you come here, bud?" Gideon asked finally. Elias didn't look up from the board he was holding steady. "Mama saw your notice in town. Said it was work." "There's work in town. Closer. Easier." "Town didn't want us." The words came out flat, factual. "People look at Mama different because she's a widow. Look at us different because we don't got a father. Like we're broken somehow, like it might be catching." Gideon drove a nail too hard and felt the wood crack slightly. "People are idiots." "Yeah." Elias glanced at him, something shifting in his expression. "Mama said you'd understand that." "She did, huh?" "She said you hired us because you're practical, not because you're nice. Said practical people don't care about stupid things like reputation or gossip. They just care if you can do the work." It was probably the most words the boy had said to him since they'd arrived. Gideon considered them while lining up another nail. "Your mother's smart," he said. "She's had to be." They finished the fence repair without further conversation. When the last nail was driven, Elias stepped back and surveyed the work with the critical eye of someone who'd learned that sloppy work meant consequences. "It's good," he said. "It'll hold." Elias nodded, then hesitated. "Anything else need fixing?" Gideon looked around the ranch, at the barn door hanging crooked, at the water trough that leaked from 3 places, at the chicken coop that had never been properly finished. 100 things needed attention. 100 things he'd been too tired or too stubborn or too alone to address. "Barn door," he said. "Hinges are shot." "I can help with that." "Tomorrow, then." The boy nodded again and headed back toward the house. Gideon watched him go, then turned back to examine the fence. The boards were straight, the nails were set properly. It was good work, better than he'd have done alone. That night at dinner, Ruby broke the silence. "Why don't you have chickens?" Gideon looked up from his plate. The girl was watching him with the unnerving directness that seemed to be her default setting. Mara had just opened her mouth to correct her daughter when Gideon answered. "Had chickens. Coyotes got them." "All of them?" "Most. The rest stopped laying, so I got rid of them." Ruby considered this. "But you've got a chicken coop." "Half a chicken coop." "We could finish it," she said. "Get new chickens. Coyotes can't get them if the coop's built right." "Ruby," Mara said quietly, "not your concern." "But it makes sense, Mama. We're eating his food. If we had chickens, we'd have eggs, could save money, could even sell extras in town." The logic was sound, irritatingly sound. Gideon took a bite of potato to buy himself time to think. "You know anything about chickens?" he asked. "We had 12 back in Laramie," Ruby said. "I took care of them. Fed them every morning, collected eggs, kept the coop clean. Had names for all of them. Pearl was my favorite. She was a Rhode Island Red and she'd—" "Ruby," Mara interrupted, "he doesn't need a chicken biography." He asked. He asked if you knew about chickens. That's a yes or no question. Ruby's mouth pinched in a way that suggested she had opinions about how conversation should be conducted, but she stayed quiet. Across the table, Elias was trying not to smile. Even Cal looked up from pushing beans around his plate. Gideon set down his fork. "Coop needs finishing first. Can't get chickens if there's nowhere to put them." "I could help," Ruby offered immediately. "You're 8. I'm good with a hammer." "Ruby," Mara said again, more firmly this time. But Gideon was looking at the girl, at the eagerness barely contained beneath her attempt at appearing reasonable, at the way she leaned forward, ready to argue her case like a lawyer, at how much she reminded him of someone. Sarah had been like that, full of plans and energy and the kind of optimism that felt exhausting when you'd forgotten how to hope. The memory came with its usual sting. "We'll see," he said. Ruby's face lit up like he'd promised her the moon. Mara shot him a look that clearly said, "You just made this my problem," but there was something else in her expression too, something that looked almost like approval. After dinner, Gideon retreated to the porch with his usual drink. He'd managed to cut back from 3 fingers to 2 over the past week, though he wasn't sure if that counted as progress or just different kinds of coping. The door opened behind him. He didn't turn around, but he knew it was Mara before she spoke. The children moved differently, louder, less certain of their welcome. You didn't have to encourage her, Mara said. I said we'd see. That's not encouragement. To Ruby, it is. She moved to the porch railing, looking out at the valley where the last light was turning the ridges purple. She gets an idea in her head, and it becomes her whole world. Doesn't understand when people say no just to avoid complications. The chicken idea is not bad. It's not about chickens. Mara glanced at him. It's about her trying to prove we're useful, trying to earn our place here before you change your mind. Gideon took a drink. I'm not going to change my mind. You say that now. I mean it. People mean a lot of things. Her voice carried no accusation, just exhausted experience. Then circumstances change, or they get tired of having us around, or they realize that 3 extra mouths cost more than they're worth. That happened before? Mara was quiet for a long moment. Twice. Both times we'd been somewhere less than a month before they found reasons why it wasn't working. Too much noise, too much space taken up, too many complications. I don't break agreements, Gideon said. Everyone says that until they do. He couldn't argue with that. He'd believed Sarah when she'd promised to be there when he got back. Belief didn't make promises true. It just made you hurt worse when they broke. Your children work hard, he said instead. Elias helped with the fence today. Did good work. Ruby's got ideas that might actually be useful. Even Cal... He paused. Does the boy talk? Sometimes. Not much since his father died. The doctor in Laramie said it was shock. Said he'd talk again when he felt safe. And he doesn't feel safe here. We've been here 8 days, Gideon. Safe isn't something you feel in 8 days. Safe is something you learn over time, when promises turn out to be true. She pushed off from the railing. I'll leave you to your evening. Mara. She stopped. I meant what I said. 1 month was the trial. But if the work's good and everyone's holding up their end, there's no reason it can't be longer. As long as it takes. She studied him in the dim light, searching for the lie. He let her look. Let her see whatever she needed to see to believe him. Finally, she nodded. All right, she said, as long as it takes. The second week brought rain, not the gentle kind that nourished crops, but the Wyoming kind that turned the whole world gray and made you question whether you'd ever been warm. It came down in sheets, flooding the low parts of the ranch and turning the path to the barn into a river of mud. Gideon spent most of the day moving cattle to higher ground, working in clothes that soaked through in the first 10 minutes. By the time he got back to the house, he was shaking from cold, and his hands were so numb he could barely work the door latch. Mara took one look at him and pointed at the chair by the stove. Sit. I'm fine. You're hypothermic. Sit down before you fall down. He sat, mostly because his legs weren't taking arguments. Mara disappeared, then returned with a blanket and a cup of something that steamed. Coffee, he realized, with something stronger added. Drink, she ordered. He drank. The heat burned all the way down, but it was the good kind of burning, the kind that reminded your body it was supposed to be warm. Where are the children? He asked. Bunkhouse. Roof leaked worse than I thought. We've got 3 buckets catching water, and they're taking turns emptying them. She poured herself coffee without the whiskey addition. Elias wanted to come help with the cattle. I told him no. Why? Because you'd have let him, and then I'd have 2 frozen idiots to deal with instead of 1. Gideon couldn't argue with that logic. They sat in silence while the rain hammered the roof. The stove kicked out heat, and slowly Gideon's hands stopped shaking. He became aware that he was sitting in Mara's kitchen. No, his kitchen, but it felt like hers now, wrapped in a blanket like a child while she moved around preparing dinner. It should have been embarrassing. Instead, it just felt necessary. Storm like this, Mara said eventually, reminds me why I hate Wyoming. Where would you rather be? She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Somewhere warm, California maybe, or down south where winter doesn't try to kill you. So why stay? Because warm places cost money I don't have. Because I've got 3 children who need stability more than they need sunshine. Because running away from weather is just another kind of giving up. She looked at him. You ever think about leaving? Every winter. But you don't. This is my land, my father's land. You don't walk away from that just because it's hard. Even if it's killing you? The question landed harder than she probably intended. Gideon stared into his coffee, watching steam rise and disappear. Dying slow's still dying, he said finally. Doesn't much matter where you do it. That's a bleak way to look at living. You got a better one?
Mara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I used to think surviving was enough, that if I could just keep my children fed and housed, nothing else mattered. But then I'd watch Ruby trying to find joy in chicken names, or Cal clutching that wooden wolf like it's the only solid thing in the world, or Elias pretending he's not terrified every time I leave his sight. And I realized surviving isn't the same as living. What's the difference? Living is when you stop just enduring and start hoping again. Gideon thought about that. About 15 years spent enduring. About waking up each day because stopping seemed like admitting defeat. About the slow erosion of anything resembling hope. I don't know how to do that, he admitted. Neither do I, Mara said. But maybe that's why we're here, learning together. The rain continued through dinner. They ate by lamplight while water dripped into buckets in the bunkhouse and wind rattled the windows. Afterward, Gideon insisted the children stay in the main house. Floor's dry here, he said. Warmer, too. You can sleep in the sitting room. Mara started to protest, then looked at her children. At Cal, shivering despite the blanket wrapped around him. At Elias, trying not to show how cold he was. At Ruby, whose lips had gone slightly blue. Just for tonight, she said. They made pallets on the floor. Gideon gave them his spare blankets, the good wool ones he'd been saving for no reason he could name. The children settled down quickly, exhausted from a day of fighting the storm. But Gideon couldn't sleep. He lay in his bed, listening to the sounds of other people breathing in his house, to the soft murmur of Mara's voice as she checked on each child, to the creak of floorboards as she finally settled herself on the couch. It felt wrong. Not bad wrong. Just wrong, like when something that shouldn't fit somehow does, and you don't know what to do with that information. He stared at the ceiling and tried to remember the last time there were children sleeping under his roof. Tried and failed because there never had been. He and Sarah had talked about it, had planned, but plans weren't the same as reality, and reality was 3 children breathing softly in his sitting room while rain tried to drown the world outside. Somewhere around midnight, he heard soft footsteps. Then a small voice. Mr. Vale? He sat up. In the darkness, he could barely make out Ruby standing in his doorway, blanket wrapped around her shoulders. What's wrong? Cal's crying. He does that sometimes when there's storms. Mama says it reminds him of the day Papa died because it was raining then too. Gideon pushed back his blankets. Where's your mother? She fell asleep. She doesn't sleep much usually. I didn't want to wake her. He followed Ruby to the sitting room. Sure enough, Cal was curled up on his pallet, crying softly into his wooden wolf. Elias was awake too, sitting beside his brother, looking helpless. I tried talking to him, Elias whispered, but he won't answer. He just keeps crying. Gideon stood there, uncertain. He knew cattle and fence wire and how to survive winters. He didn't know crying children, didn't know what words would help or if words even could help. But then he thought about Sarah leaving, about all the nights he'd wanted to cry and couldn't, about how grief doesn't care about being convenient or quiet or adult. He sat down on the floor beside Cal's pallet. Hey, he said quietly. Cal didn't look up. Storm's loud, Gideon continued. I don't like them much either. They make the whole world feel like it's ending. Still nothing. My father died in a storm, Gideon said. Not rain like this. Snow. Big blizzard that came down so fast and hard you couldn't see 3 feet. He went out to check the cattle and never came back. We found him the next day, frozen about 50 yards from the barn. So close he could have made it if he'd just known which direction to go. Ruby was watching him now. So was Elias. For years after, Gideon said, I hated snow, hated winter, hated anything that reminded me of that day. And I had this old saddle of his, kept it in the barn, used to go out there and just sit with it when things got bad. Didn't fix anything, didn't make him less dead, but somehow it helped. He gestured to the wooden wolf. That your father's? He asked Cal. The boy nodded against his pallet. It's a good wolf. He carved it well. Cal's crying had quieted to soft hiccups. He clutched the wolf tighter. You know what wolves do in storms? Gideon asked. They pack up close together, share warmth,
Keep each other safe. That's how they survive things that would kill them alone. He glanced at Ruby and Elias, then back to Cal. You've got a good pack here, he said. Your mother, your brother, your sister, they're keeping you safe, even when it doesn't feel like it. Cal finally looked at him. His face was wet with tears, his eyes red and exhausted. It's okay to be scared, Gideon said, and it's okay to cry. But you're not alone in this storm, you understand? For a long moment, Cal just stared at him. Then, so quietly Gideon almost missed it, the boy spoke. Not alone, Cal whispered. It was the first time Gideon had heard his voice. Ruby's hand flew to her mouth. Elias's eyes went wide. And from the couch, Mara sat up. Apparently she hadn't been sleeping as deeply as they'd thought. That's right, Gideon said, keeping his voice steady despite the tightness in his chest. Not alone. Cal's eyes drooped. The crying had stopped. Within minutes, he was breathing the heavy rhythm of sleep, the wooden wolf still clutched in his small hands. Gideon stood up carefully and found Mara watching him with an expression he couldn't read. Thank you, she said quietly. He shook his head. Just stop the crying. You did more than that. He didn't know how to respond to that, so he didn't. Just nodded goodnight and went back to his room, where he lay awake until dawn, thinking about wolves and storms and what it meant to not be alone. The rain stopped by morning. The sun came out hard and bright, turning every puddle into mirrors and making steam rise from the wet wood. Gideon emerged to find Mara already up, making breakfast while the children still slept. Coffee? She asked. Please. She poured him a cup, and they stood together at the window, watching the valley wake up. Cal spoke last night, Mara said. That's the most he's said in 14 months. Might not mean anything. It means something. She looked at him. You're good with them. Better than you think. I just talked. Didn't do anything special. You treated him like a person instead of a problem. You'd be surprised how rare that is. The children woke soon after. Cal seemed different this morning, still quiet but not shut down. He ate breakfast without being prompted, and even helped Ruby clear the plates. When they headed back to the bunkhouse to clean up the storm damage, he went without hesitation. Elias lingered behind. What you said last night, the boy started, then stopped. Yeah? About your father, was that true? Every word. Elias nodded slowly. I hate quarries now. Hate the sound of rock breaking. Hate dust. Mama says that'll fade, but I don't think it will. It doesn't fade, Gideon said. You just learn to live with it. That doesn't sound much better. It's not better. It's just true. The boy considered this with the seriousness of someone far older than 11. Then he said, Thanks for helping Cal. He helped himself. I just sat there. No, Elias said firmly. You sat there on purpose. That's different. Then he was gone, leaving Gideon alone with Mara in the kitchen. He's right, you know, she said. About what? About you sitting there on purpose. About you choosing to help when you could have stayed in bed. Gideon shrugged. Kid was crying. You could have told me to handle it. You were asleep. I've woken up for less. She was pushing him toward something, he could tell. Toward acknowledging what had happened as more significant than he wanted to admit. But acknowledging things gave them power, and Gideon had spent 15 years making sure nothing had power over him. It was one night, he said. Storm's over. Mara studied him for a long moment. Then she smiled, a small, knowing thing that suggested she saw exactly what he was doing and why. One night, she agreed, storm's over. But they both knew it wasn't that simple. Storms, once they get inside you, tend to stay. 3 weeks in, the ranch started looking different. Not transformed. Transformation suggested something dramatic and complete. This was subtler. The kind of change that happened when people stopped just occupying space and started inhabiting it. The chicken coop got finished, and Ruby spent 2 days researching breeds before Gideon took her into town to buy 6 hens. The barn door hung straight for the first time in years. The water trough no longer leaked. Even the bunkhouse roof got properly patched. Though it took Gideon and Elias most of a Saturday to do it right, the work felt different with help. Less like punishment, more like progress. But progress, Gideon was learning, had a way of attracting attention. And not all attention was welcome. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday. Gideon was riding the northern fence line when he noticed something wrong. Fresh cuts in the wire. Not clean breaks from weather or animals. Deliberate cuts made with tools. He dismounted and examined the damage, feeling that old familiar tension settle into his shoulders. Someone had been on his property. Someone who wanted him to know it. He followed the fence west for another quarter-mile and found 2 more cuts. Then hoofprints in the soft ground near the creek. Multiple horses. Recent enough that the edges hadn't dried yet. The riders had come through during the night, done their damage, and left. This wasn't random vandalism. This was a message. When he got back to the ranch, Mara took one look at his face and knew something had shifted. What happened? Fence got cut. 3 places on the northern line. Animals? Men. He unsaddled Ash with movements that were too controlled, too careful. Came through last night, probably. Did it on purpose. Mara's hand stilled on the dish she was washing. You know who? Got suspicions. Vern Holloway. It wasn't a question. Gideon glanced at her, surprised. You know about Holloway? Chester mentioned him when I first asked about your ranch. Said Holloway's been trying to buy up this valley for years. Said you're the only one stubborn enough to tell him no. Chester talks too damn much. Chester talks exactly the right amount for someone who doesn't want newcomers walking into trouble blind. She dried her hands on her apron, her expression troubled. What does Holloway want? My land, the water rights, control of the whole valley. Gideon poured himself coffee from the pot on the stove. He runs most of the cattle operation from here to Cheyenne, owns half the businesses in Black Hollow. The kind of man who thinks money makes him right. And cutting your fence sends what message? That he's getting impatient, that I'm supposed to understand my options are getting limited. What are you going to do? Gideon stared into his coffee. 5 years ago, he'd have ridden straight to Holloway's ranch and settled this the old way, with fists or worse. But 5 years ago, he'd had nothing to lose except his own life, and he hadn't valued that particularly high. Now there were children sleeping in his bunkhouse, a woman who'd trusted him enough to stay, chickens that needed feeding and fences that needed mending and 100 small responsibilities that meant his life wasn't just his anymore. I'm going to fix the fence, he said, and I'm going to be more careful. Mara studied him with those sharp eyes that missed nothing. That's not a solution. It's the solution I've got. For how long? He didn't have an answer for that. The second incident happened 4 days later. Gideon and Elias were moving cattle to the eastern pasture when they found 3 steers missing. Not lost. Missing. The grass showed clear signs of a drove, multiple riders pushing the animals toward the ridge. By the time they tracked the trail, it ended at the property line where the ground turned too rocky to follow. Elias sat on his horse, staring at the empty space where the tracks disappeared. They stole them, he said flatly. Looks that way. You going to report it? Gideon shook his head. Sheriff's in Holloway's pocket. Has been for years. Reporting it just wastes time and makes us look weak. So we do nothing? We take precautions, move the herd closer to the house, keep better watch at night. That's not justice. No, Gideon agreed. It's survival. Sometimes they're the same thing. Usually they're not. Elias's jaw tightened in a way that reminded Gideon uncomfortably of himself at that age. Full of righteous anger and no good outlet for it. The boy wanted to fight, wanted to push back, wanted someone to pay for the unfairness of a world that kept taking things from him. Gideon understood that impulse, had lived in it for years. Listen to me, he said. Holloway's got money, men, and influence. We've got none of that. We fight him head on, we lose. That's not pessimism, that's arithmetic. So we just let him steal from us? We let him think he's winning. There's a difference. Doesn't feel different. It's not supposed to feel good, Elias. It's supposed to keep us alive long enough to figure out a better play. The boy looked like he wanted to argue more, but something in Gideon's tone must have convinced him the conversation was over. They rode back in silence, and Gideon felt the weight of trying to teach lessons he'd barely learned himself. That night, Ruby noticed the tension at dinner. Something's wrong, she announced, looking between Gideon and her mother. You're both doing that thing where you pretend everything's fine, but you keep looking at each other like you're having a whole conversation nobody else can hear. Ruby, Mara warned. What? I'm right. Something happened. Gideon set down his fork. The girl deserved honesty more than protection, he figured. She was smart enough to piece things together anyway. We had some cattle go missing, he said. 3 steers, probably taken by men working for a rancher named Holloway. He's been trying to pressure me off this land for a while now. Ruby processed this information with the seriousness it deserved. Can't you report it? Not much point. Holloway owns the law around here. That's not fair. No, it's not. So what are we going to do? The "we" hit Gideon harder than he expected. Ruby said it automatically, like there was no question that this was a shared problem. Like they were in this together whether he'd asked for that or not. We're going to be careful, Mara said before Gideon could answer. We're going to stay close to the ranch, and we're going to trust that Gideon knows how to handle this. It was a vote of confidence he wasn't sure he'd earned. Cal, who'd been quietly eating his dinner, suddenly spoke up. The wolf protects the pack. Everyone turned to look at him. It was only the 3rd or 4th time he'd spoken since the storm, and each time still felt like a small miracle. What do you mean, sweetheart? Mara asked gently. Cal held up his carved wooden wolf. Papa said wolves protect their family, even from bigger animals. They work together. That's right, Mara said. We're like a pack now, Cal continued, his voice small but certain. So we protect each other. Gideon felt something shift in his chest. The boy was looking at him with absolute trust, like it was simply understood that Gideon would protect them. Like that was what adults did. And Gideon was an adult, therefore he would do it. The logic was childish and airtight and terrifying. Yeah, Gideon said quietly. We protect each other. The raids escalated. Over the next 2 weeks, Gideon lost 5 more cattle, another section of fence got cut, and someone left a dead coyote hanging from his gate with a note that read, "Predators don't last long in this valley." The message was clear enough even for someone determined not to see it. Gideon started sleeping lighter, started keeping his rifle closer, started noticing things he'd previously ignored, unfamiliar riders on distant ridges, tracks that shouldn't be there, the way conversations in town would stop when he entered. Black Hollow had always been a hard place, but now it felt hostile. Even Chester, usually friendly enough, seemed nervous when Gideon came to buy supplies. You need to be smart about this, Vale, he said quietly while wrapping purchases. Holloway's not going to stop. I know. So what's your plan? Keep my head down, wait him out. Chester's expression suggested he thought that was a terrible plan, but was too polite to say so directly. And if waiting doesn't work, then I'll figure out something else. Before or after he burns you out? Gideon didn't answer that. The pressure was affecting everyone. Elias had taken to standing watch at night without being asked, which meant he was exhausted during the day. Ruby had stopped asking questions and started watching the horizon like she expected trouble to come over it at any moment. Even Cal had gone quieter again, clutching his wooden wolf and staying closer to Mara. And Mara herself had developed a permanent crease between her eyebrows that hadn't been there a month ago. We should talk about contingencies, she said one evening after the children had gone to bed. They were sitting on the porch, the autumn air cold enough to see breath, but not yet brutal. Gideon had his rifle across his knees. Mara had coffee she wasn't drinking. What kind of contingencies, he asked. The kind where we have a plan if things get worse, where we go, what we take, how we keep the children safe. Things aren't going to get that bad. You don't know that. I know Holloway. He's a bully, not a murderer. He wants me gone, but he wants it legal, or legal enough that he doesn't hang for it. There's a lot of space between legal eviction and murder, Gideon, and most of it involves people getting hurt. She was right, and he knew it. But admitting that meant admitting he might not be able to protect them, meant admitting that bringing them here might have put them in more danger than they'd been in before. If it comes to that, he said carefully, I'll make sure you and the kids get out first. And what about you? This is my land. I'm not leaving it. Even if staying means dying? Even then. Mara set down her coffee cup with more force than necessary. That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. It's principle. It's pride, and pride's just another word for stupid when it gets you killed. She turned to face him fully. You think dying for this land makes you noble? Makes you loyal to your father's memory? All it makes you is dead, Gideon, and dead men don't protect anyone. What do you want me to say? I want you to say that your life matters, that you're not going to throw it away because some rich bastard wants your valley, that we... She stopped abruptly. That you what? Nothing. Forget it. Mara. I said forget it. She stood up. I'm going to check on the children. She left before he could respond, and Gideon sat alone on the porch, trying to figure out what she'd been about to say, trying to understand why the thought of him dying seemed to bother her more than just losing a job and a place to stay. He was still sitting there an hour later when he heard horses, multiple riders coming up the road from the valley. He stood, rifle in hand, and waited. The moon was bright enough to see clearly. 4 men on horseback, riding with the casual confidence of people who expected no resistance. They stopped at his gate. The lead rider was a man named Cole Barrett, Holloway's foreman. Gideon had met him exactly once and hadn't been impressed. Barrett had the look of someone who'd learned early that size and meanness could substitute for intelligence, and he'd built his whole personality around that discovery. "Vale," Barrett called out. "Need a word." "Then talk. From there." "Rather talk closer." "Rather you didn't." Barrett's companions laughed, but it was the kind of laughter that had nothing to do with humor. Just men performing for each other, proving they weren't scared of one lone rancher with a rifle. "Mr. Holloway sent me with a message," Barrett said. "He's prepared to make you a final offer for this property. $10,000. More than fair for land that's failing anyway." "Not interested." "You should be. Because the alternative's going to be messy." "That a threat?"
That's a fact. Barrett leaned forward in his saddle. You're alone out here, Vale. No help coming if something happens. No law that cares. Just you and whatever stubborn stupidity keeps you thinking you can hold out. I'm not alone. The words came out before Gideon fully thought them through. But once said, he realized they were true. He wasn't alone. Not anymore. Barrett noticed it too. His expression shifted, became more calculating. "That's right," he said slowly. "Heard you got yourself a woman and some kids staying here. Quinn family, right? Widow and her children. Shame what happened to her husband. Tragic accident, quarry collapse. Could happen anywhere, really. Ranches got dangerous work too." The implication landed like a physical blow. Gideon's hands tightened on the rifle. Every instinct screamed at him to shoot Barrett right off his horse. But that was what they wanted, an excuse, a reason to escalate, a justification for whatever came next. "You got your message delivered," Gideon said, his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest. "Now get off my property." Think about that offer, Vale, for everyone's sake. They rode off slowly, deliberately, making sure Gideon understood they weren't leaving because they had to. They were leaving because they chose to, because the threat had been made and the fear planted. Gideon stood at his gate until the sound of hooves faded completely. Then Mara's voice came from behind him. "How bad?" He turned. She was standing in the doorway, wrapped in a shawl, her face pale in the moonlight. "You heard?" "Enough." She came down the steps. "They threatened us, the children." He was implying, not directly threatening. "There's no difference, Gideon. You know that." He did know that. Just as he knew that everything had changed in the last 10 minutes. This wasn't just about him anymore. Wasn't just about holding on to land or refusing to surrender to pressure. This was about 3 children who were counting on him to keep them safe, and a woman who'd trusted him not to get them all killed. "We need to leave," Mara said quietly. "No." "Gideon, I said no." He looked at her. "We leave. Holloway wins. Takes this land and probably destroys whatever makes it valuable just to prove he can. And where do you go? Back to running from place to place? Back to people looking at you like you're broken? Better running than dead. Maybe. But I'm done running, and I think you are too." Mara wrapped the shawl tighter around herself. "What are you proposing?" "I don't know yet, but there has to be another way. Something besides surrendering or fighting." "That's not a plan." "It's the start of one." She laughed, but there was no joy in it. "You're asking me to bet my children's lives on the start of a plan. I'm asking you to trust me. I barely know you." "You know me well enough. You've been watching me for weeks, figuring out what kind of man I am. So tell me, do you trust me or not?" The question hung between them like something physical. Mara stared at him, searching his face for something he hoped was there. Some sign that he was worth trusting. Some proof that belief wouldn't end in betrayal. Finally she spoke. "My husband used to make promises," she said. "He'd swear things would be fine.
that he had everything under control, right up until the day the quarry collapsed on top of him. So forgive me if trust doesn't come easy. I'm not your husband.
No, she agreed. You're not. He was reckless. You're just stubborn. I don't know which is worse. Mara, 3 days, she interrupted. You have 3 days to come up with something better than wait and see what happens. After that, we're leaving, with or without you. She went back inside before he could respond.
Gideon stood in the dark, wondering how you fought a man who had all the power and none of the scruples. Wondering what plan could possibly work when the law was bought, the town was scared, and every conventional option led to the same defeat. Wondering if he'd just promised something he had no ability to deliver. The next morning, Ruby made an observation. They were all in the kitchen eating breakfast. A tense, quiet affair where everyone pretended not to notice the dark circles under Gideon's eyes, or the way Mara kept glancing at the door like she expected trouble to walk through it. Mr. Holloway's made of money, right? Ruby asked suddenly. Gideon looked up from his eggs. That's what they say. And he wants this ranch because it controls water for the whole valley? Partly. Also the grazing land. The timber rights. A lot of reasons. Ruby nodded, processing. Then she asked, does he own the newspaper? The paper? No, that's run by a man named Davis. Why? Because people with money care about what other people think about their money. Papa used to say reputation was currency for rich folks. They'll do anything to protect it. Mara set down her coffee cup. What are you thinking, Ruby? I'm thinking maybe we can't fight Mr. Holloway with violence or law, but maybe we could fight him with truth. Make everyone know what he's doing. Make it public. Public how? Elias asked. Newspaper. We get Mr. Davis to print what Holloway's been doing. The fence cutting, the cattle theft, the threats. Make people see him for what he is. Gideon shook his head. Davis won't print anything that makes Holloway look bad. Too risky. What if we gave him proof? Real proof he couldn't ignore. Like what? Ruby's eyes lit up with the particular gleam that meant she was working through a problem. We document everything. Every cut fence, every missing cow, every threat. We get witnesses. We make it so obvious that even people scared of Holloway can't pretend they don't see it. It was, Gideon had to admit, not a terrible idea. Naive, maybe. Optimistic, certainly, but not terrible. Even with proof, he said, Davis might not print it. Then we take it somewhere else. Cheyenne has papers. We could mail them evidence, or ride there ourselves. That takes time we might not have. So we start now. Ruby looked around the table. What else are we going to do? Just sit here and wait for Mr. Holloway to decide when we leave? Out of the mouths of children came truth that adults spent years learning to avoid. Gideon looked at Mara, who was watching her daughter with an expression caught between pride and terror. It's risky, Mara said. Everything's risky, Ruby countered. At least this way we're doing something. Elias had been quiet, but now he spoke up. I'll help. I can ride the fence lines, document the damage, make maps of where things happened. I can write everything down, Ruby added. Keep a journal, date and time for everything. Even Cal nodded, clutching his wooden wolf. I can watch. I'm good at watching. They were all looking at Gideon now, waiting for him to decide. 3 children and a woman who'd already given him more trust than he probably deserved, asking him to believe in a plan that had come from an 8-year-old girl. He thought about Barrett's threat, about Holloway's patient malevolence, about 15 years of handling everything alone and how well that had worked out. Then he thought about wolves protecting their pack. All right, he said, we try it Ruby's way, but we're smart about it. No unnecessary risks. And if things get too dangerous, we stop. Agreed? Agreed, Ruby said immediately. Elias? The boy nodded. Agreed. Mara? She took a long breath. 3 days, Gideon. If this doesn't show progress in 3 days, we're gone. Fair enough. They spent the rest of the morning organizing. Ruby found an old ledger in Gideon's office and started recording everything they knew. Dates, locations, descriptions. Elias rode out with Gideon to photograph the cut fences and missing cattle areas with a battered camera they found in a trunk. Even Cal helped, his sharp eyes spotting details the adults missed. By evening, they had the beginnings of a case. Not enough yet. Not nearly enough to convince a newspaper or sway public opinion, but enough to feel like they were fighting back instead of just enduring. That night, after the children had gone to bed, Gideon found Mara on the porch again. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For staying. For trusting this. For raising a daughter who's smarter than both of us combined." Mara smiled slightly. "Ruby gets that from her father. He was always looking for the angle nobody else saw. Drove me crazy sometimes, but it's probably why I fell in love with him." It was the first time she'd mentioned loving her husband. Gideon felt an unexpected twist of something that might have been jealousy if he'd let himself name it. "You must miss him," he said. "Every day. But missing someone and moving forward aren't opposites. Took me a long time to understand that." She looked at him. "What about you? You ever miss your wife?" "I miss who I thought she was. Turns out that person never existed." That's a lonely way to remember someone. It's an honest one. They sat in silence for a while. Then Mara said, "This plan of Ruby's, you really think it could work? I think it's the best chance we've got. And I think your daughter understood something I've been too stupid to see." "What's that?" "That fighting doesn't always mean hitting back. Sometimes it means making sure everyone's watching when the hitting happens." Mara considered this. "And if everyone's watching, but nobody does anything? Then at least we tried. At least we didn't just accept defeat." "You've changed," she said quietly, "since we arrived. You're still stubborn as hell, but you're not as sealed off." "Is that good or bad?" "It's human, which is the same thing, I suppose." Gideon looked out at the valley, his father's valley, the land he'd been willing to die for without ever questioning if that willingness was courage or just another kind of giving up. Now there were people here who needed him alive more than they needed him martyred. That changed everything. 3 days, he said. "We'll have something worth showing in 3 days. Promise?" "Promise." It was only after she'd gone inside that Gideon realized he'd just made another promise he might not be able to keep, but this time the thought didn't terrify him quite as much. This time, he wasn't promising alone. The 3 days turned into a week, and the week brought winter's first real bite. Not snow yet, but the kind of cold that warned it was coming soon, the kind that made your bones ache and your breath fog thick enough to hide behind. Gideon woke each morning to frost covering everything. The world turned silver and brittle, beautiful in the way dangerous things often are. They worked methodically. Elias rode fence lines every other day, documenting new damage with the precision of someone who understood that details mattered. Ruby maintained the ledger with dates, times, and descriptions so thorough that Gideon wondered if she'd missed her calling as a lawyer. Even Cal contributed, his quiet observations catching things the rest of them overlooked. A horseshoe print with a distinctive chip, a piece of torn fabric caught on wire. Small evidence that added up to a larger picture. But evidence without audience was just paper and ink. They needed someone to care. That's what brought Gideon to town on a gray Thursday morning, riding alone because bringing the children felt too much like painting targets on their backs. The streets of Black Hollow were quiet, most people staying inside where fire and coffee made the cold more bearable. He tied Ash outside the newspaper office and stood for a moment, gathering courage he didn't quite feel. The bell above the door jingled when he entered. The office was cramped and smelled like ink and old paper. A man sat at a desk buried under stacks of copy, his sleeves rolled up and ink stains decorating his fingers like dark tattoos. He looked up when Gideon entered, and his expression shifted from curiosity to wariness in the space of a heartbeat. "Vale," he said. Not unfriendly, but not welcoming either, just acknowledgement. Davis. Harold Davis was 40-something, with thinning hair and the tired eyes of someone who'd seen too much and written about too little of it. He'd run the Black Hollow Gazette for 15 years, printing news that mattered only when it didn't threaten the people who mattered more. "If you're here to place an advertisement, I'm afraid our rates have gone up," Davis said. "I'm here to give you a story." "What kind of story?" "The kind that might get you in trouble, or might make you relevant again. Depends on how brave you're feeling." Davis set down his pen carefully. "I'm a newspaper man, Vale, not a crusader. There's a difference." "I know the difference. I'm betting you used to know it too." Something flickered across Davis's face, anger maybe, or recognition of a truth he'd been avoiding. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the empty street. "What do you want from me?" he asked finally. I want you to print the truth about Vern Holloway. And what truth would that be? That he's been systematically destroying my ranch to force me off my land. Cut fences, stolen cattle, threats, all documented, all provable. Davis turned from the window. You have proof? Gideon pulled out the ledger Ruby had compiled. Careful handwriting, precise dates, maps drawn by Elias showing locations. He set it on the desk. Davis picked it up and started reading. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. He read slowly, turning pages, occasionally making small sounds that might have been acknowledgement or might have been doubt. This is thorough, he said eventually. My cook's daughter put it together. 8 years old with better organizational skills than most adults I know. The Quinn family. I heard they were staying with you. Davis closed the ledger. You realize what you're asking? Holloway owns half this town. Print this, and I'll lose advertisers, lose subscribers, might lose the whole paper. Might also get the story of the decade. Man using wealth and intimidation to steal land. Local newspaper stands up to corruption. That's the kind of thing that gets picked up by bigger papers. The kind that matters. Or it's the kind that gets my office burned down and me run out of town. Maybe. But at least you'd go down swinging instead of just waiting for Holloway to decide when you're no longer useful. Davis laughed, but it was bitter. You're asking me to commit professional suicide based on the word of a man most people think is halfway crazy in a ledger kept by a child. I'm asking you to do your job. Print news. Let people decide what matters. People already decided. They decided Holloway's money is more important than some stubborn rancher's principles. Gideon leaned forward. Then change their minds. That's what newspapers are supposed to do, isn't it? Challenge assumptions, expose truth. Or has this town beaten that out of you already? For a long moment, Davis just stared at him. Then he looked down at the ledger again, his fingers drumming on its cover. I need corroboration, he said. Other witnesses, people willing to go on record. I can get you that. And I need time to verify locations, cross-check dates. How much time? A week? Maybe 2. Gideon shook his head. You've got 3 days. After that, I'm taking this to the Cheyenne papers myself. 3 days isn't enough to... 3 days is what you've got. Use them or don't, but that's the window. Davis looked like he wanted to argue more, but something in Gideon's expression must have convinced him it would be wasted effort. Instead, he picked up the ledger and held it for a moment, feeling its weight. If I do this, he said quietly, we're both dead men. You know that, right? I know that doing nothing kills us slower, but just as sure. That's not inspiring, Vale. Wasn't trying to inspire, just stating facts. Davis set the ledger back down and extended his hand. 3 days. But I'm not promising anything. Gideon shook it. Fair enough. He left the newspaper office feeling like he'd just lit a fuse without knowing how long it was or what it was attached to. The cold bit harder on the ride home, and by the time he reached the ranch, his hands were numb inside his gloves, and his face felt like frozen leather. Mara met him at the door with coffee already poured. How'd it go? She asked. He's thinking about it. That's not a yes. It's not a no either. Best I could manage. She handed him the coffee, and he wrapped both hands around it, letting the heat seep through. Ruby appeared from the kitchen, flour dusting her apron, her face expectant. Did he take the ledger? She asked. He took it. Will he print the story? Don't know yet. Said he needs 3 days. Ruby's expression fell slightly, but she rallied. 3 days? That's better than never. That's one way to look at it. It's the only way to look at it, Ruby said firmly, because never means we already lost, and 3 days means we might win. The girl's optimism was exhausting in the way that hope always is when you've spent years expecting disappointment. But Gideon found himself almost believing her, almost letting himself think that maybe, just maybe, this could work. That night, trouble arrived without warning. Gideon woke to Ash screaming in the barn, the kind of panicked sound horses make when something's wrong beyond their understanding. He was out of bed and grabbing his rifle before full consciousness arrived, moving on instinct and adrenaline. Outside, the world was dark and cold and wrong. Smoke. He could smell smoke. The barn. He ran across the yard in his boots and undershirt, the cold forgotten in the face of immediate crisis. The barn door stood open, and inside he could see the orange glow of fire starting to catch in the hay. Not an accident. This was deliberate. He grabbed buckets, started hauling water from the trough, throwing it on flames that wanted to grow faster than he could drown them. Ash was going mad in his stall, hooves pounding wood, whites of his eyes showing bright in the firelight. Then Elias was there, and Mara, and even Ruby carrying buckets too heavy for her but carrying them anyway. They worked in frantic silence, passing buckets in a chain, water sloshing and spilling, but enough reaching the fire to make a difference. 10 minutes that felt like hours. The flames fought them, kept finding new fuel, kept spreading faster than seemed possible. But slowly, agonizingly, they started to lose ground. The orange glow dimmed, the smoke shifted from thick black to gray. And finally, mercifully, the last ember died under a bucket of water that Elias threw with force, born of exhausted rage. Gideon stood in the ruined barn, breathing hard, clothes soaked and hands burned from hot metal. Around him, the others looked equally destroyed. Mara's face streaked with soot, Ruby shaking from cold and exertion, Elias staring at the damage with murder in his eyes. "Everyone all right?" Gideon asked. They nodded, too tired for words. Cal appeared in the doorway, still in his nightclothes, clutching his wooden wolf. He looked at the destruction, then at Gideon, and his small face crumpled. "They hurt us," he whispered. Mara swept him up immediately, holding him close. "We're okay, baby. We're all okay." But they weren't okay. The barn was half destroyed, hay ruined, equipment damaged, and Ash, when Gideon finally got him out of his stall, was injured, a burn along his flank where falling embers had caught him. Not serious, but painful enough to make the horse flinch from touch. This wasn't a warning anymore. This was war. "We're leaving," Mara said once they were back in the house. Her voice was flat, final. "Tonight, right now. We pack what we can and we go." "Mara, don't." She held up a hand. "Don't tell me it's going to be fine. Don't tell me we can fight this. They just tried to burn us alive, Gideon. They set fire to your barn with your horse inside and didn't care who else got hurt. Which is exactly why we can't leave. They want us scared, want us running. Maybe they're right to want that. Maybe running is the smart choice. Running means they win. And staying means we die." Her voice broke on the last word. "I can't do this. I can't watch my children get hurt because I was too stubborn to see sense. We're leaving." Ruby spoke up from where she sat wrapped in a blanket. "No. Ruby, this isn't up for discussion. They want us gone, Mama. That's why they did this. Because Mr. Davis has our evidence, and they know he might actually print it. They're scared." "They're not scared," Mara said. "They're dangerous. There's a difference." "There's not." Ruby stood up, her 8-year-old frame trying for a dignity she almost achieved. "Papa used to say scared people are the most dangerous kind because they do things thinking people won't. They set fires and make threats and hurt animals. But that means we're winning. That means they're worried. Your father also said survival matters more than pride. He said a lot of things, Mama, including that standing up to bullies was worth the risk. You remember that? Remember him talking about the foreman at the quarry who was stealing wages? Papa reported him even though everyone said it was too dangerous. Got the man fired. Almost got himself fired too. But he did it because it mattered." Mara's face went pale. "And look what happened to him. He died in an accident, not because he stood up to someone. You can't live your whole life scared that doing the right thing will get you killed." "I can when my children's lives are at stake." The room went quiet. Everyone was looking at Mara now, Ruby with desperate hope, Elias with uncertainty, Cal with confusion, and Gideon with something that felt uncomfortably like respect and terror mixed together. Finally, Elias spoke. "I want to stay," he said quietly. Mara turned to him. "Elias, I'm tired of running, Mama. Tired of moving from place to place because people don't want us or because things get hard. We've been here less than 2 months, and already it feels more like home than anywhere since Papa died. I don't want to leave." "Me neither," Ruby added. Cal just nodded, clutching his wolf tighter. Mara looked at her children like they'd betrayed her, like they'd sided with danger over sense, and she couldn't understand how they'd learned to be so reckless. Then she looked at Gideon. "This is your fault," she said. "You made them believe they could fight this. You gave them hope when you should have given them reality." "Maybe," Gideon admitted. "Or maybe I just reminded them they're not victims unless they choose to be."
Easy words from someone who's got nothing to lose. I've got plenty to lose. He gestured at the children. They're sitting right here.
The admission hung in the air like smoke. Gideon hadn't meant to say it so directly, hadn't meant to acknowledge how much these people had come to matter in such a short time. But it was out now, true and unretractable. Mara stared at him, and for a moment her anger wavered. If we stay, she said carefully, and something happens to one of my children, I will never forgive you, or myself. If you leave, and they spend the rest of their lives running, learning that standing up means getting knocked down so you might as well stay down, will you forgive yourself for that? That's not fair. None of this is fair. Fair stopped mattering the moment Holloway decided my land was worth more than my life. Now it's just about what we do next. Mara closed her eyes. Gideon could see the war happening behind them, every instinct screaming at her to protect her children, every lesson her husband had taught fighting against every fear his death had created. 3 days, she said finally, eyes still closed. That's what you told Davis. 3 days, and if nothing changes, if he doesn't print that story, we're gone. And this time I mean it. Agreed. And you, she opened her eyes and pointed at Gideon. You keep watch, round the clock. No more surprises, no more fires. You see anything suspicious, anything at all, you wake me. I will. And the children stay close to the house. No riding fence lines, no solo trips to check cattle. We stay together. Mama, Elias started to protest. Together, she repeated firmly. Or we leave now. Choose. The boy subsided. Ruby nodded. Cal just kept holding his wolf. All right, Mara said, looking at each of them in turn. 3 days. But after that, we're done. Win or lose, we're gone. I won't risk you any more than that. She went to check on the kitchen, leaving the rest of them sitting in heavy silence. Ruby was the first to speak. She's scared. She's smart, Gideon corrected. Fear and smart look the same sometimes. Will Mr. Davis really print the story? I don't know. But you think he might? Gideon thought about the way Davis had held the ledger, the way his fingers had drummed on its cover like he was fighting with himself, the way he'd looked when Gideon challenged him about relevance and courage. I think he wants to, Gideon said. Whether he will or not depends on whether wanting is enough. The next morning brought visitors. Gideon was repairing what he could of the barn damage when he heard horses. Multiple riders again, but these weren't Holloway's men. He recognized Chester Morrow's substantial frame on the lead horse, and beside him rode 2 other men Gideon knew by sight, if not by name, Marcus Webb, who ran the feed store, and Tom Brennan, a small rancher who operated on the eastern edge of the valley. Gideon set down his hammer and walked out to meet them, rifle still close because trust was a luxury he couldn't afford anymore. Chester dismounted with a grunt of effort. Heard you had trouble last night, he said. News travels fast. Fire lights up the sky, travels faster. Barn burned? Partly. We got it out before total loss. Chester looked at the damage, his expression grave. That's Holloway's work. Can't prove it. Don't need proof to know truth. Chester glanced at his companions. That's why we came. Tom here had fences cut last week. Marcus lost 3 steers to rustling. Neither of them wanted to say anything because, well, you know how it is. But after hearing about your barn, they figured staying quiet wasn't keeping them safe anyway. Tom Webb spoke up, a lean man with a weathered face and nervous eyes. Holloway's been pressuring me to sell for 6 months. Every time I say no, something bad happens. Fence damage. Water trough poisoned. Nothing I could prove, but nothing that felt like accident either. Same here, Marcus added. He wants consolidation, wants the whole valley under his control. Anyone who won't sell becomes a problem he needs to eliminate. Gideon felt something shift in his chest. Not hope exactly, but something adjacent to it. You willing to say this publicly? He asked. The 3 men exchanged glances. Depends what you mean by publicly, Chester said carefully. I mean on record, in the newspaper, as witnesses to Holloway's methods. Tom went pale. That's asking for trouble. You've already got trouble. At least this way you'd be fighting back. Fight back how? Marcus asked. Man owns half the territory, owns the law. What's a newspaper story going to do except make him mad? Make him exposed, Gideon said. Make it so his methods aren't secret anymore. Rich men can get away with a lot when nobody's watching, less so when everyone is. Chester was nodding slowly. You talked to Davis. Gave him evidence 3 days ago. He's considering running the story. And you think adding our testimony would help? I think it would make the story bigger than just one stubborn rancher. Make it about a pattern of intimidation. Make it harder to ignore. The 3 men were quiet, thinking. Gideon could see the war happening in each of them, the desire to fight back against the fear of consequences, the same war that had been happening inside him for weeks. Finally, Tom spoke. My wife's scared. She wants us to sell, take what we can get, move somewhere safer. Mine too, Marcus said. But if we sell, Tom continued, where do we go? We've got roots here. Got family buried in the Valley Cemetery. Got years of work invested in land we actually own. Selling means losing all of that because one rich bastard decided he deserves it more than we do. So you'll talk to Davis? Gideon asked. Another long pause. Then Tom nodded. I'll talk to him. Me too, Marcus said, though he looked like he might be sick. Chester clapped both men on their shoulders. Good. I'll get word to Davis today. Set up meetings. And Vale. He turned to Gideon. You watch yourself. Holloway knows you're organizing now. That makes you more dangerous to him than just being stubborn. I'm always careful. Careful didn't save your barn. No, Gideon agreed. But maybe numbers will save what's left. After they left, Gideon stood in his yard, feeling something he hadn't felt in longer than he could remember. Not alone. He went inside to find Mara cooking lunch, her movements efficient, but tense. She glanced up when he entered. Who was that? Chester and some others. They want to add their testimony to the newspaper story. Holloway's been hitting them too. Mara's hand stilled on the knife she was using. So it's bigger than just us. Looks that way? Does that make it better or worse? Better. Means we're not fighting alone. Also means we're not suffering alone. Everyone's getting hurt by this. She went back to cutting vegetables with more force than necessary. Gideon watched her for a moment, seeing the tension in her shoulders, the tightness around her mouth. You're still angry, he said. I'm terrified. There's a difference. Terrified of what? Of letting my children believe in something that might kill them. Of watching you play hero when heroes tend to die messy. Of hoping things might work out when experience has taught me they usually don't. She set down the knife and turned to face him fully. You want to know what scared me most about last night? She asked. It wasn't the fire. It was watching my children fight it without hesitation. Watching Ruby carry buckets twice her weight. Watching Elias throw water on flames that could have caught him too. Watching Cal's face when he said, they hurt us, like he was part of something worth defending. That sounds like you raised brave kids. I raised survivors. There's a difference. Survivors know when to run. Brave people stay and fight, and sometimes die for it. Sometimes they win. Not often enough. Gideon moved closer, close enough to see the fear making her hands shake slightly. You want guarantees. I can't give you those. Best I can offer is my word that I'll do everything I can to keep you safe. All of you. Words are just noise, Gideon. Then watch my actions. Have been for 2 months now. What do they tell you? Mara studied his face like she was reading a map in a language she only half understood, looking for landmarks that would tell her which direction led to safety and which led off a cliff. They tell me you're the kind of man who means what he says, the kind who'd throw himself in front of danger without thinking, which should be comforting but mostly just scares me more. Why? Because I've already lost one man who thought protecting people was more important than protecting himself. I don't think I could survive losing another. The admission hung between them, heavy with implications neither of them was quite ready to name. Before Gideon could respond, Ruby burst through the door. Mr. Davis is here, she announced, in a wagon. He brought papers. They all rushed outside to find Harold Davis climbing down from his wagon, his arms full of what looked like proof sheets and notebooks. He saw them emerging, and his expression was grim. We need to talk, he said. About the story? Gideon asked. About war. Because that's what this is going to become when this hits the press tomorrow morning. He spread papers across the kitchen table while everyone gathered around. Gideon saw pages laid out with headlines, articles, the ledger's information transformed into column inches of devastating documentation. I verified everything, Davis said. Dates, locations, testimony from Webb and Brennan, and 4 others who came forward after hearing you were collecting evidence. It's all there. Pattern of intimidation spanning 3 years, 27 documented incidents, 15 witnesses willing to go on record. You're actually doing it, Mara breathed. I'm committing professional suicide, Davis corrected. But yes, I'm doing it, because your daughter was right about something. He looked at Ruby. You said reputation was currency for rich folks. You were right. Holloway built his empire on people believing he was legitimate. Take away that belief. Show everyone what his methods really are, and the whole thing gets shakier. Won't destroy him, but it'll hurt. And maybe that's enough. What do you need from us? Gideon asked. Need you alive to testify if this goes to actual court. Need you visible in town so people know you're not backing down. And need you prepared for retaliation because it's coming. Tomorrow morning, everyone in 3 counties is going to read about Vern Holloway's criminal behavior. He's not going to take that quietly. We'll be ready, Gideon said. Davis looked around at all of them. At Gideon standing tall despite obvious exhaustion, at Mara trying to hide her terror, at 3 children who'd somehow become soldiers in a war they never asked for. I hope you mean that, he said. Because ready or not, the storm's coming. He left 30 minutes later, papers repacked and wagon rattling back toward town. The sun was setting, turning the sky orange and red like the fire from the night before, and Gideon stood in his yard watching it burn across the horizon. Tomorrow, the story would print. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, they'd learn whether truth was actually stronger than money, or if that was just another story people told themselves to make fighting feel worthwhile. Mara came to stand beside him. Still think this is the right choice? She asked. Don't know. But it's the choice we made. We could still leave, tonight, before the paper prints, before Holloway retaliates. We could, Gideon agreed. You want to? She was quiet for a long moment, watching the same burning sky. No, she said finally. I want to stay. I want to fight. I want my children to see that sometimes standing up matters more than staying safe. But I'm still terrified. Good. Terror means you understand what's at stake. What is at stake? Gideon thought about that question, about land and principle and the difference between surviving and living, about 3 children who'd reminded him what it felt like to have something worth protecting, about a woman who'd rebuilt more than just his kitchen. Everything, he said. We're fighting for everything. The sky finished burning and night fell like a curtain. Tomorrow would bring consequences. Tonight, they'd prepare for them together. The newspaper hit the streets at dawn. Gideon didn't sleep waiting for it, just sat on his porch with his rifle and watched the night turn gray, then pale, then finally bright enough to see the valley properly. Mara brought him coffee around 5, neither of them speaking because there wasn't anything left to say that hadn't been said already. By 7, Chester arrived on horseback, waving a copy of the Gazette like a battle flag. It's done, he called out, still 20 yards from the house. Davis printed every damn word. Gideon took the paper with hands that wanted to shake but didn't. The headline stretched across the top in bold letters that felt like shouting, Land Baron's Reign of Terror, Holloway accused of systematic intimidation. Below it, columns of text documented everything. The cut fences, the stolen cattle, the threats. Testimony from 15 witnesses, their names printed in black and white for everyone to see. Ruby's careful documentation transformed into evidence that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. It's good work, Chester said. Davis didn't pull any punches, laid it all out like a prosecutor building a case. Half the town's already talking about it. What are they saying? Some think you're brave, some think you're stupid. Most are just scared of what Holloway's going to do next. Chester dismounted and tied his horse. But they're talking. That's what matters. Can't pretend not to see it now that it's in print. Mara appeared in the doorway, Ruby and Elias behind her. Even Cal had woken early, sensing that today was different from every day that had come before it. Can I see? Ruby asked. Gideon handed her the paper. She read the headline, her eyes going wide, then started reading the article itself. Her lips moved slightly as she worked through the words, and when she reached the part where witnesses were named, she looked up with something like awe. They did it, she whispered. They all stood up. They did, Gideon agreed. Because you gave them a reason to believe it mattered. What happens now? That was the question nobody wanted to answer because the answers were all variations of violence or surrender, and neither felt particularly good. Chester answered instead. Now we wait. See if public opinion forces the territorial marshal to investigate. See if Holloway's business partners start getting nervous. See if exposure actually means anything, or if it's just ink on paper. And if it's just ink, Mara asked, then at least we tried. It wasn't the reassurance she'd been hoping for, Gideon could tell. But Chester wasn't the reassuring type. He was the honest type, which was better even if it hurt more. The first response came faster than expected. By mid-morning, 3 riders approached the ranch. Not Holloway's men this time, but people Gideon recognized from town. Sarah Brennan, who ran the general store. Michael Chen, who owned the livery. And Pastor Williams from the church Gideon hadn't attended in 15 years. They came on foot, leading their horses, their postures suggesting they came in peace, even if they weren't quite comfortable about it. Sarah spoke first. We read the article. And? Gideon asked. And we wanted you to know that some of us believe you. Some of us have been watching Holloway operate for years and knew something was wrong, but didn't know how to say it without making ourselves targets. She glanced at her companions for support. We're saying it now. You're not wrong about him. Saying it to me doesn't change anything. No, but we're not just saying it to you. We're saying it to the marshal when he arrives. We're saying it to anyone who asks. We're making it clear that this isn't just one rancher with a grudge. This is a community problem that needs addressing. Pastor Williams nodded. The church congregation took a vote this morning. 14 families pledged support for an official inquiry into Holloway's business practices. That's not nothing, Vale. It wasn't nothing, but it also wasn't enough to stop a man with money and meanness and nothing left to lose. Appreciate the support, Gideon said carefully, but you should know that standing with me might make you targets too. We know, Michael Chen said. We decided it was worth the risk. They stayed for coffee, talking quietly about logistics, and who else might be convinced to speak out. Ruby served them with the seriousness of someone who understood she was watching history happen, even if it was small history in a small town. After they left, Elias pulled Gideon aside. You think it's really going to work? The boy asked. All this testimony and newspaper articles? Honestly, I don't know. Never fought a war with words before. Usually just used fists and stubbornness. But you think it's got a chance? Gideon looked at the boy, at the hope fighting with skepticism in his young face, at the way he was learning to believe in things while simultaneously learning that belief didn't guarantee outcomes. I think it's got a better chance than giving up, Gideon said. And sometimes that's all you can ask for. The second response came at noon. Holloway himself rode up to the gate with 4 men. Not Barrett this time, but Holloway personally, a tall man in his 50s with silver hair and the kind of face that looked respectable until you noticed the coldness in his eyes. He wore a suit that probably cost more than Gideon's entire ranch, and he sat his horse like someone who'd never doubted his right to be wherever he decided to be. Gideon met him at the gate, rifle in hand but pointed at the ground, a show of readiness without outright threat. Vale, Holloway said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. We need to discuss this unfortunate situation. Nothing to discuss. Everything that needed saying got printed in the paper. Ah, yes, the paper. A collection of lies and exaggerations from disgruntled men who couldn't make their ranches profitable and need someone to blame. Funny how 15 separate liars all told the same lie in the same detail. Holloway's smile didn't reach his eyes. You're making a mistake. A very expensive one for everyone involved. Only mistake I made was not doing this sooner. You think exposure hurts me? You think a newspaper article changes anything? Holloway leaned forward slightly. I've been building my operation for 20 years. I have contracts with the Army, deals with the railroad, investments in Chicago and Denver. What do you have? A failing ranch and some frightened neighbors who'll abandon you the moment I make it clear what supporting you costs. Maybe. Or maybe you're here because you're worried. Rich men don't waste time threatening people who can't hurt them. Something flickered in Holloway's expression. Anger, maybe, or recognition that Gideon had hit closer to truth than was comfortable. I came to make you an offer, Holloway said. One final offer before this gets worse than it needs to be. $15,000 for your property. That's $5,000 more than I offered last time. Take it, leave quietly, and everyone forgets about this newspaper nonsense. And if I don't, then I stop being patient, stop trying to do this the civilized way, and you learn what it means to truly make an enemy of someone with resources. Already learned that. Barnfire was pretty educational. I don't know what you're talking about. Sure you don't. Just like you don't know about cut fences and stolen cattle and dead animals left at my gate. Just like you don't know about the men who threatened my family. Holloway's face went cold. I'm a legitimate businessman. If you're experiencing criminal activity, perhaps you should report it to the proper authorities instead of printing slanderous accusations. Already did. Marshall's supposed to arrive tomorrow. Looking forward to sharing all our evidence with proper authorities. For the first time, Holloway's composure cracked slightly, just a tightening around his eyes, a tension in his jaw. Then it smoothed out again, back to that practiced respectability that made him so dangerous. You're gambling with lives, Vale, not just yours. That woman and her children, they deserve better than to be caught in the middle of your prideful stubbornness. They deserve better than watching me surrender to intimidation. Funny how that works. Holloway studied him for a long moment. Then he straightened in his saddle. The offer expires at sunset. After that, you're on your own. No more negotiations, no more mercy, just consequences. He rode away without waiting for a response, his men following in formation. Gideon watched them disappear down the valley road, then turned to find Mara standing on the porch. She'd heard everything. 15,000 is a lot of money, she said quietly. It is. We could go anywhere with that. Start fresh somewhere Holloway's influence doesn't reach. Keep the children safe. Could do that. But you're not going to take it. No. Why not? Gideon walked back toward the house, suddenly tired in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. Because 15 years ago, someone I trusted left without explanation or warning, just decided I wasn't worth staying for and disappeared. And I've spent every year since then afraid to let anyone close because they might leave too. He looked at her directly. You and your children, you came here with nothing. Could have left a dozen times when things got hard. Could have left last night after the fire. Could have left this morning when you saw that newspaper and realized what it meant. But you stayed. You kept staying. And that's worth more than any amount of money Holloway could offer. That's sentiment, not strategy. Maybe. But strategy kept me alive and alone for 15 years. Sentiments kept me alive and part of something for 2 months. I know which one I prefer. Mara's eyes were bright with something that might have been tears, or might have been fear, or might have been both. You're asking us to risk everything on a maybe. Maybe the marshal will help. Maybe public opinion will matter. Maybe Holloway will back down. That's a lot of maybes. Yeah, but the alternative is definitely giving up. I'm done with definite defeats, ready to try some maybe victories. She laughed despite herself, sharp and a little broken. You're either the bravest man I've ever met or the most foolish. I genuinely can't tell which. Could be both. They look the same sometimes. Ruby appeared between them, having apparently been listening from inside. We're staying, right? That's not your decision, sweetheart, Mara said. But we're staying, Ruby insisted, because running away means they win, and they don't get to win just because they're mean and rich. That's not how it's supposed to work. That's exactly how it works most of the time, Mara said gently. Then most of the time is wrong, and somebody has to be the ones who make it right. Out of the mouths of children came the kind of idealism that adults learn to temper with experience. But maybe, Gideon thought, maybe that idealism was what changed things. Maybe you needed people young enough to still believe right mattered more than might. We're staying, Mara said finally. But if anything happens, anything, we leave immediately. No arguments, no delays. Agreed? Agreed, Gideon said. The rest of the day passed in tense waiting. Neighbors stopped by in small groups, some offering support, others just wanting to see if Gideon was really as crazy as people said. The general consensus seemed to be that he was crazy, but maybe in a way that was necessary, like how you needed crazy people to do things that sensible people knew were impossible. Chester returned at sunset with news. Marshall's coming for sure, arriving tomorrow morning on the early stage. Davis sent him a copy of the paper plus additional documentation. He's got no choice but to investigate now, not with this much attention on it. Holloway know? Everybody knows. The marshal sent word ahead. Probably thought it would keep things calm, knowing official law was coming. Or it makes Holloway desperate. Man with nothing to lose is more dangerous than one who thinks he can still win. Chester nodded grimly. That's what I'm worried about, which is why I'm staying here tonight. Me and Tom Webb and Marcus Brennan, we're taking shifts on watch. You need sleep, Vale. Can't fight a war if you're falling over from exhaustion. I can manage. I know you can, but you don't have to anymore. That's what community means. Let us help. It was strange accepting help after so many years of refusing it. Strange in a good way, like wearing new boots that hadn't broken in yet but would feel perfect once they did. That night, Gideon actually slept. Not well, and not deeply, but he slept knowing that people he trusted were keeping watch. Knowing that if trouble came, he wouldn't be facing it alone. It was a different kind of rest than he'd known in years, the kind that came from shared burden rather than isolated endurance. He woke to Ruby shaking his shoulder. Mr. Gideon, the marshal's here, and so is Mr. Holloway, and there's a lot of other people too, like a lot. He dressed quickly and went outside to find what looked like half the town gathered in his yard. The marshal stood in the center, a gray-haired man named Thompson who Gideon had met exactly once and hadn't been impressed by. But beside Thompson stood Harold Davis with his notebook, and behind him clustered at least 30 townspeople, all watching with the attentiveness of people who'd come to witness something important. Holloway was there too, with his lawyer and 3 of his men, his expression furious beneath a veneer of civility. Quite the audience, Gideon said quietly to Chester, who'd materialized at his elbow. Word got out that Thompson was coming. People wanted to see what happened. Some are here to support you. Some are here to support Holloway. Most are just here because it's the most interesting thing to happen in Black Hollow in a decade. Marshal Thompson raised his hand for quiet. All right, settle down. I've reviewed the evidence submitted by Mr. Davis and the testimony collected from multiple sources. I've also heard from Mr. Holloway's legal representation regarding these allegations. Given the seriousness of the claims and the number of witnesses involved, I'm opening an official investigation into potential criminal intimidation and property destruction. Holloway's lawyer stepped forward. Marshal, my client categorically denies all allegations. This is clearly a coordinated smear campaign by competitors who failed to meet their financial obligations and seek to blame my client for their own inadequacies. That'll be for the investigation to determine, Thompson said. In the meantime, I'm ordering all parties to cease any aggressive actions. No more property damage. No more threats. Any violations will result in immediate arrest, regardless of who commits them. How do you plan to enforce that? Someone called from the crowd. By making it clear that territorial law applies to everyone, rich or poor, successful or struggling. You break the law in my jurisdiction, you answer for it. It was a pretty speech. Gideon wondered if Thompson actually meant it, or if he was just performing for the audience. Hard to tell with lawmen sometimes. They said what needed saying and did what needed doing, and the two didn't always align. Holloway spoke up, his voice carrying that smooth authority. Marshal, I'm happy to cooperate fully with any investigation. I'm confident you'll find these allegations are baseless. However, I must insist that this spectacle is damaging to my business reputation, and I reserve the right to pursue legal recourse against those spreading false claims. You can pursue whatever you want after the investigation concludes, Thompson said. Until then, everyone's going to calm down and let me do my job. Understood? There were murmurs of agreement, some enthusiastic, some reluctant. Holloway's face suggested he understood perfectly, but wasn't happy about it. His eyes found Gideon across the crowd, and the look he gave promised that investigations and marshals were temporary, but consequences were permanent. The crowd slowly dispersed, people breaking into smaller groups to discuss what they'd witnessed. Davis immediately started interviewing witnesses for a follow-up article. Chester and the other ranchers formed a protective circle around Gideon, making it clear whose side they were on. Mara appeared from inside the house with coffee and biscuits, serving the men who'd stayed the night to stand watch. Ruby helped distribute cups, her face serious with the importance of it all. Even Cal emerged, clutching his wooden wolf, watching everything with wide eyes. You did good, kid, Chester said to Ruby. That ledger of yours is probably what convinced Thompson to take this seriously. Ruby beamed. I just wrote down what happened. Sometimes that's all you need to do. Truth's powerful when you let it speak for itself. The marshal approached Gideon after most of the crowd had cleared. Vale, I need formal statements from you and anyone else willing to testify. Can you come to my office in town this afternoon? I can do that. Bring your documentation. Anything that proves timeline, location, damages. More evidence I have, better case I can build. You actually planning to build a case? Or is this just for show? Thompson's expression hardened. I don't do show. If Holloway's guilty of what you're claiming, he'll answer for it. If he's not, then you'll answer for slander. Either way, truth's going to come out. Fair enough. After Thompson left, Gideon found himself alone with Mara for the first time all morning. She was cleaning up coffee cups, her movements efficient but distracted. You think it's really over? She asked. The threats? The danger? No. But I think we bought ourselves time, and time's all we needed. Time for what? Time for people to stop being scared. Time for witnesses to find courage. Time for the truth to matter more than intimidation. She set down the cups and looked at him directly. And after the investigation, after whatever happens with Holloway, what then? Then we keep living, keep working the ranch, keep raising chickens and fixing fences and all the ordinary things that make up a life. Is that what you want? Ordinary? Gideon thought about the question. A month ago, ordinary would have felt like surrender, like giving up on the isolation and bitterness he'd built his identity around. But now, after weeks of shared meals and children's laughter and someone caring whether he lived or died, ordinary sounded like the best thing he'd ever heard. Yeah, he said. I want ordinary. Want to wake up to breakfast? I didn't burn myself. Want to hear Ruby asking impossible questions, and Elias learning to run cattle, and Cal talking more each day. Want to sit on the porch at night with someone who doesn't leave just because things get hard. He paused, then continued more quietly. Want to stop being afraid that anything good is just temporary? Mara's eyes were definitely wet now. That's what you're offering? Ordinary and not temporary? If you'll take it. I spent 2 years looking for exactly that. Somewhere my children could be children instead of burdens. Somewhere I could stop running. Somewhere that felt like home instead of just another stop along the way. She smiled, and it was the first genuine smile he'd seen from her in days. Think I'd be stupid to turn that down. Think you'd be smart to consider it carefully. I'm not easy to live with. Spent 15 years getting set in my ways, still not great with words or feelings or any of the things that probably matter in a real family. Good thing we're not looking for perfect, just looking for someone who shows up, someone who stays. I can do that. Staying's pretty much all I'm good at. She laughed, and it sounded like hope. Ruby interrupted by running outside with Elias and Cal in tow. The marshal wants us all to come give statements. He said even kids can testify if they saw things. Then we'll all go, Mara said. Together. They rode into town that afternoon as a group. Gideon, Mara, and the 3 children, plus Chester and several other ranchers who'd decided safety was in numbers. The streets were busy with people who'd heard about the morning's confrontation and wanted to hear more details. The marshal's temporary office was in a building behind the general store. Thompson had set up a proper interview space with a desk and chairs and an official-looking ledger where he recorded testimony. He interviewed each person separately, taking careful notes, asking clarifying questions, treating the process with the seriousness it deserved. When Ruby's turn came, she sat in the chair that was too big for her and answered every question with precision that made Thompson's eyebrows rise. You're very thorough, he said. My papa said if you're going to do something, do it right or don't do it at all. Smart man, your father. He was. He died being smart, actually. Reported safety violations at the quarry, even though everyone said it was too risky. They fired the foreman, fixed the problems. Papa thought everything was better. Her voice got quieter. Then there was an accident anyway. Different kind of accident. But he died knowing he'd tried to make things safer, even if it didn't save him. Thompson set down his pen. And you're trying to make things safer here? I'm trying to make things right. There's a difference. Safe is when nobody gets hurt. Right is when people who hurt others have to answer for it. That's a very mature perspective for someone your age. I'm 8. That's not that young. I've seen enough to know how things work. After all the statements were recorded, Thompson addressed the group. I'll be conducting this investigation for the next 2 weeks, checking locations, verifying claims, interviewing additional witnesses. If the evidence supports criminal charges, I'll file them. If it doesn't, I'll close the case. Either way, you'll all be notified of the outcome. 2 weeks. Elias said on the ride home. That's a long time to wait. It's how law works, Gideon said. Slow and careful. Not like frontier justice where you just shoot first and sort it out later.
Which one's better? Depends on whether you want justice or just revenge. One of them actually fixes things. Other one just makes you feel better temporarily. Which one do you want? Gideon thought about that. A month ago, he'd have said revenge without hesitation. Would have welcomed the chance to settle things with Holloway the old way, direct, violent, final. But now, with 3 children listening and a woman who'd trusted him to do this right, revenge felt hollow.
Justice, he said. Turns out, I want justice. The 2 weeks passed with agonizing slowness. The marshal conducted his investigation methodically, visiting damaged properties, interviewing witnesses, documenting everything with official precision. Holloway's lawyer filed counterclaims and character witnesses, turning the whole thing into a legal battle that nobody really understood but everyone had opinions about. Life on the ranch continued. Fences got mended, cattle got fed. The chicken coop project finally finished, and Ruby's 6 hens started laying eggs with impressive regularity. Elias learned to rope cattle with something approaching competence. Cal spoke more often, full sentences now instead of whispered fragments. And Gideon learned what it meant to have a family. Not the idea of family he'd held on to from his marriage to Sarah, some perfect ideal that had never really existed, but actual family, messy and loud and frustrating and absolutely essential. Arguments over whose turn it was to do dishes. Ruby's endless questions about how everything worked. Elias's teenage sullenness that meant he was processing something he didn't know how to articulate. Cal's nightmare that required the whole household to wake up and reassure him that monsters weren't real. The ordinary chaos of people living together. It was exhausting. It was wonderful. On the 13th day, Marshal Thompson returned. He arrived in the afternoon with a folder thick with documents and an expression that gave nothing away. Everyone gathered in the kitchen because that had become the unofficial meeting place for important discussions. I've completed my investigation, Thompson said without preamble. Found sufficient evidence to support charges of criminal intimidation, property destruction, and conspiracy to commit fraud against Vern Holloway and 3 of his associates. I've filed official charges with the territorial court. There will be a hearing in 2 weeks to determine if the case proceeds to trial. The room was silent for a moment as everyone processed what they'd heard. Then Ruby asked, "Does that mean we won?" "Means you took the first step toward winning," Thompson corrected. "Legal process is long. Could take months to resolve fully, but yes, charges have been filed. That's not nothing." "What about Holloway?" Gideon asked. "He been notified?" "This morning. He's hiring lawyers from Denver, planning to fight this aggressively, so don't celebrate too early. Long way between charges and convictions." "But it's a start," Mara said. "It's a start." After Thompson left, nobody quite knew what to do with the news. They'd been bracing for disappointment so long that success, even partial success, felt unfamiliar. Chester started laughing first, a deep belly laugh that shook his whole frame. "We did it, actually did it. Got charges filed against the most powerful man in 3 counties. "Charges aren't convictions," Gideon reminded him. "Don't care, just filing them is more than anyone thought possible 6 weeks ago. That's worth celebrating." He was right. Even if Holloway eventually won in court, even if money and lawyers found loopholes and technicalities, they'd proven something important, that ordinary people could fight back, that documentation and truth and collective courage mattered, that wolves protecting their pack could survive against bigger predators. That night, they had a real celebration. Mara cooked a feast, roast chicken, potatoes, fresh bread, even a pie made from preserved berries Ruby had found in the pantry. They ate until they were full, then kept eating anyway because it felt right to mark the moment with abundance instead of scarcity. After dinner, Gideon found himself on the porch with Mara while the children played some complicated game involving Cal's wooden wolf and stick figures they'd carved from kindling. "You did good," Mara said. "Standing up like that, fighting when most people would have surrendered. We did good. Wasn't just me." "No, but it started with you. Started with you being stubborn enough to refuse Holloway's offers, brave enough to put up that notice asking for help, open enough to let us stay when every instinct probably told you to send us away. Best decision I never wanted to make." She smiled at that. "I've been thinking about something." "What's that?"
about the future, about what happens after the trial, after everything settles, about whether this arrangement we've got is temporary or something more permanent. Gideon's heart did something complicated in his chest. They'd been dancing around this conversation for weeks, both of them knowing it needed to happen, but neither quite ready to start it. "What do you want it to be?" he asked. "I want my children to have stability. Want them to know where home is and trust it'll still be there tomorrow. Want them to have someone besides me they can count on." She paused. "And I want to stop being scared that caring about someone means I'm going to lose them. Can't promise you won't lose me. Accidents happen. People die. That's just how life works." "I know that, but there's a difference between losing someone to life's randomness and losing someone because they chose to leave. I've had both. The choosing hurts worse." "I'm not going anywhere, Mara. Probably couldn't leave this valley if I wanted to. It's in my bones now." "And us? Are we in your bones too?" He looked at her, really looked, seeing not just the woman who'd shown up desperate for work, but the person who'd rebuilt his house and his life and his capacity to hope for things. "Yeah," he said. "You're in my bones too. You and Ruby's questions and Elias's stubbornness and Cal's wolf. All of it. Can't imagine this place without you anymore." "That's not exactly a proposal. I'm not exactly good at proposals. Probably would mess it up if I tried." "Try anyway?" So he did. Not with fancy words or dramatic gestures, just with honesty hard-earned through months of learning what it meant to let someone matter. "Marry me," he said. "Make this official. Give your children a father who shows up. Give me a reason to keep being better than I was. Build something together that's stronger than what we could build alone." Mara was crying now, but smiling through it. "That's the worst proposal I've ever heard." "It's the only proposal you've heard from me. It's perfect." She kissed him, quick and certain, like sealing a deal that both parties knew was good business. "Yes? Obviously, yes." Ruby's voice came from inside. "Did he ask? Did Mama say yes? Because if she didn't, I'm going to be very disappointed in both of you." They went inside to find all three children watching from the doorway with expressions ranging from excitement to satisfaction to quiet joy. "You were listening," Mara said. "We weren't trying to," Ruby protested. "But you were talking kind of loud, and also we wanted to know." "And?" Gideon asked. "And it's about time," Elias said. The closest thing to approval the boy had given since they'd arrived. "Was getting tired of watching you two pretend you didn't care about each other." Cal just nodded and held up his wooden wolf. "Pack," he said simply. "Pack," Gideon agreed. They married 6 weeks later in a small ceremony that felt more like a community celebration than a private affair. The trial against Holloway was still pending, but somehow that felt less important now. Win or lose in court, they'd already won the things that mattered: family, home, the knowledge that standing up to fear was possible even when the outcome was uncertain. Pastor Williams performed the ceremony in the ranch house because it felt right to start their official life together in the place where it had really begun. Chester stood up as witness. Ruby cried despite insisting she wasn't going to. Elias looked uncomfortable in the clean shirt Mara had forced him to wear. Cal clutched his wooden wolf through the entire ceremony like it was his job to keep everyone safe. And Gideon, who'd spent 15 years believing he'd never want this again, found himself meaning every word of the vows. For better or worse, in sickness and health, for as long as they both lived. This time he believed in the promise. This time so did the person promising back. Spring came to Black Hollow Valley the way it always did, reluctantly, fighting winter for every inch of ground. But when it finally arrived, it arrived complete. Snow melted, grass returned. The valley transformed from harsh survival into something that actually resembled living. The trial concluded with a split verdict. Holloway was convicted on 3 counts of property destruction and fined heavily. The intimidation charges didn't stick because proving intent was harder than proving action. He lost several business contracts when investors decided his reputation wasn't worth the risk. His empire didn't collapse, but it cracked enough to let other ranchers breathe easier. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was justice nonetheless. Holloway never directly threatened Gideon again. Whether that was because of legal consequences or because Gideon was no longer alone was impossible to say. Probably both. Bullies operated best against isolated targets, and Gideon had stopped being isolated. Years passed the way years do, with seasons and celebrations
and the occasional crisis that required everyone to pull together. Ruby grew into a young woman with her mother's intelligence and her father's determination, eventually going off to study law because she'd decided the world needed people who understood how to fight with truth instead of violence. Elias took over more ranch operations each year, learning that stubbornness was a tool that worked better when combined with wisdom. Cal never became particularly talkative, but he spoke when it mattered, and his carved wolves became local art that people collected. And Gideon learned that the wilderness he'd spent 15 years fighting wasn't the land outside. It was the isolation inside. The belief that needing people was weakness, the fear that caring meant inevitable loss, the stubborn pride that insisted surviving alone was nobler than thriving together. All of it was wilderness that needed conquering more than any frontier. On a spring evening, years after that first notice had gone up in the trading post, Gideon sat on his porch with Mara beside him and watched their valley turn purple in the sunset. The house was full of noise, grandchildren visiting, neighbors stopping by for dinner, the ordinary chaos of a life lived with others instead of despite them. "You ever regret it?" Mara asked. "Letting us stay that first day?" Gideon thought about the question, about everything that had come from that choice, the danger and fear, the fighting and uncertainty, the legal battles and close calls, about everything he'd gained too, family and purpose, and the knowledge that isolation wasn't safety, just a different kind of dying. "Not once," he said. "Even when it got hard?" "Especially then. Easy things don't teach you anything. Hard things teach you what you're capable of when you stop being afraid to try." Mara leaned against his shoulder, and they sat together watching the same sunset they'd watched hundreds of times before and would watch hundreds more, weather and health permitting. Inside, Ruby's daughter was asking the same kind of impossible questions her mother used to ask. Elias was teaching his son about cattle work with the patience he'd learned from Gideon. Cal's grandchildren were playing with a whole collection of carved wolves, building elaborate stories about packs that protected each other through every kind of wilderness. And in the trading post in Black Hollow, that old notice still hung on the wall, faded now, barely readable, kept more as reminder than advertisement. Cook wanted, room and meals provided, must endure hard work and silence. But everyone who saw it knew the real story, knew that what answered that notice wasn't just a cook. It was courage disguised as desperation. It was family disguised as employment. It was proof that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let someone pass the walls you built to keep yourself safe. And that the hardest wilderness to conquer isn't the frozen landscape outside. It's the guarded territory of a heart that forgot how to hope. In Black Hollow Valley, that wilderness was finally, completely, thoroughly conquered. Not through violence or force, but through the simple revolutionary act of letting people stay.